We are going to begin on our STAAR, Jarrett Chapter 9, America in World War I, Part 2. Keep in mind this is for the STAAR test, and this is aimed directly at the STAAR material. So let us begin. It's a relatively short presentation, about 9 slides or so. Let's begin with the first one, a new kind of war. And this is something that we have discussed previously, but I want to make sure we all understand it. New kind of war. And here are some images of some of the new types of weapons that are mentioned in the second bullet. You have trench warfare, airplanes, tanks, machine guns, and submarines. But let's start at the very first bullet. Both sides predicted that the war would be over soon. Both would be tremendously wrong. For whatever reason, the generals on both the Allies and the Central Powers believed that they would be able to win the war quite quickly, within a few months, and they could be not further from the truth. It dragged on for a little over 4 years and wound up costing over 20 million lives. Bullet number 2, new weapons being introduced were machine guns, poison gas, submarines, airplanes, and tanks. And of course, I've shown you some of these, and we've seen some images of these before. These new weapons made it easier, looking at the third bullet, to defend rather than to attack. So let's clear this up a little bit right here. If you are using some of these new weapons, again, let's go with the very top of trench warfare. And you had a position that was defended by machine guns, and you had aerial support, and you had backing you up someplace tanks who really could not cross over right here very easily. But if you had them backing you up, then there's really no need to attack. You just sit there and hold your territory. And because of that, and because of the horrible conditions which we have discussed previously, this type of warfare was extremely bloody and extremely dangerous. Trenches were dug along the French eastern border. You can see right there in yellow that indicates the trenches. The eastern border with Germany, and it was called the Western Front because it is Germany's Western Front. And that area right in there, this area right in here, is where you had hundreds, maybe thousands of miles of trenches that were dug by both sides. Millions of men digging these trenches. And again, you can see a little bit of what the trenches look like right there. And so pretty soon, because of that, the Western Front become a very deadly area. The bulk of the 20 million dead, a huge chunk of them would die in the trenches along the Western Front. Let's move on to our next slide. Trench warfare. And here's a couple of images. In the bottom right, you can see what appear to be German soldiers, and I believe they are German soldiers by the look of their helmets. They are climbing out of the trench, making their way to attack. Over here on the left, you can see a machine gun position within a little crater, maybe a little bomb crater. Maybe it was dug by the men there. You can see also that they're wearing gas masks because of the threat of poisonous gas. Also, you can see the number of dead at the bottom in the middle. It's a little bit difficult to read. And you can see it's divided into a pie chart. We're not going to really break it down at this moment, but this will give you an idea of the Central Powers. 36% of the deaths were caused by their military. Central Powers. The first one was the Allied powers in the blue right here, and then you had the Central Powers right there, and then you had civilians and the Central Powers, and then the Allies' Central Power civilians. So right here, that is the percentage of people on the Central Power, I'm sorry, I don't know why I keep saying Central Powers, I'm sorry, on the Allied side who died. We're looking at about 56%. And then over here, let's clear this up a little bit, more easily seen. And then we have the rest of it, Central Power death, or dead. So you can see more allies than Central Power, more good guys than bad guys died. And part of that is due to any number of reasons. The Germans were a little bit quicker to develop and use the airplane to their advantage. The Germans were a little bit quicker and much more willing to use submarines to their advantage. They killed thousands of people in submarine attacks. A number of other reasons. Let's get back to our main topic for this slide, the trench warfare. It was a new and strange form of war no one ever really seen before. Now again, people had, one time or another, fought in a trench or in a bomb crater or behind a rock or something. Right? Nothing new there. But the fact that we, both the good guys and the bad guys, the Allies and the Central Powers, both the good guys and bad guys dug hundreds of miles of these trenches, that is new. These trenches were separated by barbed wire and landmines, and the area between them was known as no man's land, and it became a killing zone. As these individuals over here in the bottom right are climbing out of the trench to advance toward the next trench, the enemy trench, they would have to fight their way through machine gun fire, such as right here, perhaps poisonous gas, as we see these people wearing gas masks right there, barbed wire, possibly airplanes strafing them, artillery from behind the lines, any number of things. And no man's land was an area, if you got caught in no man's land, your chances of survival were extremely limited. The third bullet, soldiers would spend years in these trenches, not necessarily 365 days straight, but they would spend years in the trenches. They would be in the front lines for 2 or 3 months, to go back for a few weeks, get a little rest and relaxation, go back to the trenches for another few months, and then back and forth, if you were, of course, lucky enough to survive. So again, you would spend literally years going in and out of the trenches, back and forth from trench to trench, advancing, retreating, advancing, retreating, back and forth again and again and again over the same territory. And as you can well imagine, the death toll was horrendous. Let's move to the next slide. Causes of U.S. involvement in the war. Now, we've documented this previously, but I want to make sure that we go over it again, just to make sure there are no questions or comments. First bullet, when the war broke out in Europe, we, America, attempted to remain neutral. We attempted to hide behind our ocean, the Atlantic. We attempted to stay out of the fight because it was part of our nature. And this neutrality, this isolationism goes all the way back, of course, to George Washington. And we have attempted to remain neutral from Washington up to this point. And we're looking at 140-something years at this time, from Washington leaving office to the outbreak of World War I. And we have been relatively successful remaining out of European affairs. But there's always that. But we would become involved due to a couple things. And there are 5 of them mentioned here. The first one, our close ties with England and France. This goes back, of course, the British go back to, well, the Pilgrims. I mean, they are our father, they are our mother, they are our family. The British Empire created the colonies, which led to the United States of America. France, of course, aided us in the American Revolution. They gave us the Statue of Liberty. They had been a friend to us on numerous occasions, and those close ties is what propelled us into the war on their side, or part of it. That's maybe the best reason. Depends on who you speak to. Number 2, Germany declares unrestricted submarine warfare. They start to sink any and all ships. This is after, number 3, they had promised not to sink neutral ships, part of the Sussex Pledge, and we'll get to that in a few moments again. But they began to break that promise because of the British blockade of German ports. So, close ties with England and France. Germany breaks their promise to not sink neutral ships they began unrestricted submarine warfare. All these are leading us to entering the war on the good guys' side. Allied propaganda number 4. They portrayed the Germans as committing atrocities against civilians, and they did. The unrestricted submarine warfare is a form of atrocity, and there are others, and we already have seen some examples of this propaganda. And finally, the Zimmerman note, the Zimmerman telegram. It's referred to both in history books. The Germans offered Mexico a deal to join the war on Germany's side to harass America on the southern border, and in return for that promise, the Mexicans would be given back the land that they had lost to America, essentially, which would be Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, California. Our next slide, the Zimmerman note. Speaking of which, the Zimmerman note, the German ambassador, Zimmerman, sent a telegram, and there's an image of it down here in the bottom right-hand corner. I know it's a little bit difficult to read, but there's an example of it, dated January 19th, 1917, really about 4 or 5 weeks before we entered the war. Zimmerman sent this telegram to Mexico, basically saying, we, Germany, will return to you the lands of the southwestern part of the United States if you, Mexico, attack the United States, and once we win the war, then those lands would be returned to you. Again, we're referring to Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California. The telegram was intercepted. Now, it could have been it was turned over to America by the Mexicans. I'm not really sure. I've never really read anywhere in any history book details of that. So this says it was intercepted. It could have been intercepted. It could have been given to us by the Mexicans to prove that they were on our side. I don't know. But what does matter is that it was published in American newspapers, and as you can well imagine, the yellow journalists went crazy. They had a good time with this, and Americans screamed for war. As you can well imagine, a foreign power, a European power, is attempting to entice our neighbor, Mexico, to go to war with us. In return, they'd be given lands that we rightfully owned, we rightfully possessed. All right. Our next slide, freedom of the seas. This is something that has been a huge issue with the United States. And of course, you go back to the War of 1812. A major reason we went to war with England, again, the War of 1812, was because of the violation of freedom of the seas by the Brits. They were stopping American ships, seizing American sailors, and forcing them to serve on British ships. So, freedom of the seas is really the main reason we finally entered the war. Now, all these reasons add up, but if you only had to choose one, this would be the reason. If only one thing had happened and this was it, the unrestricted submarine warfare, this would have sent us to war. Second bullet, British had blockaded Germany and the German ports, preventing them, the Germans, from getting food and supplies from some of their allies, from some of their trade partners. And Germany, which of course is somewhat landlocked. There is a small coast they have on the northern coast. Again, not ideal. When the weather turns bad in winter, those ports are not really that accessible. But the English blockaded those ports, and of course Germany was surrounded by its enemies. The French and the English to Germany's west, and the Russians to Germany's east. So getting food and supplies into Germany any other way besides ship was extremely difficult. Germany retaliated to the blockade. By sinking merchant ships with their submarines. Any merchant ships heading toward England or France in a no-sail zone, if you wish, in a war zone, that Germany said, this is the war zone, you cannot go into the zone, they sank. And of course the idea was to not only starve the French, but starve out the English and keep them from getting supplies and food from their allies, their trade partners like us, the United States. The next bullet. The Germans continued to sink ships until America threatened to end relations with Germany, which is the so-called Sussex Pledge. Germany sank a French ship called the Sussex. After that, we contacted the Germans and said, hey, you got to stop this. We, the United States, cannot allow you to continue to sink these ships without some kind of warning, without some type of provisions being made to help the survivors. And so the Germans made the Sussex Pledge, which was not to sink not to sink merchant ships without some kind of warning or without helping the survivors of the attack. Now, of course, the problem with submarines, as we have discussed previously, they're not very big. They cannot take on a lot of passengers. Really not designed for that. So they were to warn the ship they're about to attack, so that way the ship about to be attacked, can get off a mayday, or possibly evacuate some of the women and children, some of the civilians on the ship in the lifeboats, so that way they stood a chance of survival. Our next slide, the sinking of the Lusitania. Now, the Lusitania was a British passenger liner, and there's a picture down here, a postcard of the Germans. Oh man, their arrogance is hard to imagine sometimes. They made this postcard. There was an image of Lusitania being sunk, and you can see right here the lines of what appear to be another torpedo as it's about to hit the Lusitania. And so the Germans made this postcard basically advertising their sinking of the Lusitania. This Lusitania, again, British passenger ship, was sunk by a German U-boat. Ship carried about 1,200 passengers, of which 128 were Americans. Now, I think those are really the wrong numbers. It should have been about 1,200 dead and 128 Americans dead. I don't think every American on board the ship died. I think this is a little bit of a misstatement here, but there were upwards of 1,100 to 1,200 dead, and definitely 128 Americans died as a result of the sinking of the Lusitania. This was the first time, and this is important, this is the first time Germany had actually killed an American. Clean this up a little bit right there. The first time Germany had actually killed an American in the attacking of a ship by the U-boats. And of course, once again, Americans called for war. There really should be an apostrophe S there, I'm sorry. As I told you, this is a STAAR PowerPoint that we have been using for a few years, and I looked it over. I guess I missed that. There really should be an apostrophe S there. I apologize for that, sorry. Let's move on. Alright, I'm back. I know you didn't notice I was gone, but I was for a few moments. Anyway, I'm back. Unrestricted submarine warfare. After the Sussex Pledge, after the Germans had promised not to sink any more civilian ships without some kind of warning or some kind of assistance being rendered to the ship being sunk, the Germans started unrestricted submarine warfare. An image over here of a German sailor from the U-boat looking at the ship he had just sunk with the caption, "Swim with the fish." Again, this is not my picture. This is from the PowerPoint. Kind of cold-hearted, but the Germans were that way at times. Again, they were fighting a total war. So, Germany was suffering greatly from the British blockade, and they decided, and then they declared they would start using unrestricted submarine warfare to sink any ship that they found in the area they designated as off-limits. Bullet number 2, this violated what we believe to be the principle of the freedom of the seas, particularly those of neutral nations like America. So we, the United States of America, could ship non-military goods to nations at war. Now, of course, the Lusitania was sunk. Its holds were filled with weapons that we were shipping to the British. Not really important at this moment, but again, we were shipping a lot of military goods to the nations at war, particularly our allies, the English and the French. And so the Germans came up with this: we're going to sink anyone, anywhere, anytime we see them, using unrestricted submarine warfare, and you better stay out of our way. Our last bullet on this slide, President Wilson then asked Congress for a declaration of war. After all that had been going on for the 2.5 years or so by this time the war had started, finally, in April of 1917, April 1917, President Wilson asked for a declaration of war, and Congress gave it to him. All right, really that's it. There's the STAAR question we're going to look at. A pretty simple one, actually. I thought we'd go ahead and do it. It was included in the PowerPoint, so I didn't delete it. And here is STAAR practice question number 1. What event in American history does this newspaper headline refer to? Okay, I realize it may be a little bit difficult for some of you to see, depending where you're seated at this time. Let me read it to you. Lusitania sunk by submarine, probably 1,260 dead. Twice torpedoed off Irish coast, sinks in 15 minutes. Captain Turner saved, Turner being the captain of the Lusitania. Frohman and Vanderbilt missing. Two well-known Americans, I believe, at that time. Two well-known Americans at that time were missing. Washington believes a grave crisis at hand. And here is a little bit of an image of the Lusitania. So, what event in American history does this newspaper headline refer to? We walk through it. Is it A, American Revolution, B, Civil War, C, Spanish-American War, D, World War I? Well, I mean, the answer is pretty easy because, that's what we're studying right now is letter D, World War I. So, as you go through, you would kind of scratch these out. This is I'll just work them all out right there. That's fine. And so letter D would be the correct answer. Now, this is pretty simplistic, but it does sort of give you an idea of some of the types of questions that you may see. In our final slide there, yes, the correct answer is letter D. Sinking of Lusitania was a major cause of America entering World War I. Okay, now this ends our second part of our STAAR PowerPoint. Our video over the STAAR PowerPoint, we have 2 more parts we'll get to, and we'll get to those later.